Hi, I'm Paul Miguel, professional wildlife photographer, and this video is all about photographing birds in flight. I made a video back in 2017 on birds in flight photography. That video was more of a general one, covered a lot of the aspects that you need to know and was particularly useful for beginners, I think. This video is much more advanced, so it's aimed at more serious bird photographers and particularly those people who have more advanced camera systems. So quickly, I'm just going to recap some of the basics. The most important thing is that you have the continuous autofocus selected. So on Canon, that's AI Servo. Other cameras, it's probably AFC. So the continuous tracking autofocus. Shutter speed, I would say you want to be anything from 1,000th of a second, preferably higher. If you can get it up to 2,000th of a second, then that might improve your hit rate. You want to make sure that you're on a continuous frame rate, so continuous shooting. That's going to vary from camera to camera. This Canon 1DX Mark I will do up to 12 frames a second. In terms of exposure mode, which is the best exposure mode to use, if you look at the other video, I went into that in more detail. Myself personally, I tend to prefer manual exposure in very consistent light. So typically if it's very sunny, blue sky, then I'll actually take a reading of something neutral. I'll set the exposure, check that on the histogram, and then I'll stick with that for the rest of the time. The other option I use in more inconsistent light is actually to use aperture priority with auto ISO. So that's one that I often use if the light's more inconsistent and often around sunrise and sunset where you're getting a mixture of light and shade. So there I'll use aperture priority and auto ISO. So what about image stabilisation? Is this something that helps in birds in flight? This is something I forgot to mention in the first video. And some lenses will have image stabilisation or vibration reduction, some won't have them at all. Like this Canon 400 f5.6 doesn't have any image stabilisation. So some people are under the idea that the image stabilisation actually reduces subject movement, and that's actually not true. So the image stabilisation will not affect the actual subject movement. That's really down to shutter speed. What the image stabilisation does is allow you to handhold the lens at slower shutter speeds. So it's basically helping to stabilise the lens and the camera, essentially reducing camera shake when you're actually moving the camera around. Now, because you're generally using very fast shutter speeds for photographing those flying birds, it's already going to help to reduce camera shake. So I don't really think the image stabilisation has a massive effect, particularly if you're going to be at like 1/2000th of a second, for example. I would say any image stabilisation is not really going to have much effect on reducing that camera shake. However, it can be useful for another reason. When you're using a big lens, it can be sometimes difficult to find the bird in flight and to track it. It's not a very easy thing to do, particularly with 500, 600mm lens. So in that case, if you turn on the image stabilisation, what it's actually doing is helping to stabilise the viewfinder, and that makes it easier to track the bird. So for that reason, sometimes with the big 500mm lens, I'll switch on the image stabilisation, not to particularly help to get a sharper image, but just to help stabilise the viewfinder, and that makes it easier for me to track the bird in flight. That said, there is a downside to switching on the image stabilisation, and that's that it simply uses more battery power, so it's going to drain the battery more, and birds in flight is something where you need to take lots of pictures and use lots of battery. So if you're using the image stabilisation all the time, you may find your battery's going to run out quicker than you'd like it to. And the other possible reason, maybe a bit more contentious, there is a school of thought that actually switching on image stabilisation can slow down the autofocus. So from my point of view, anything that I think is going to reduce the chances of the focus working as fast as it possibly can, if I don't need it, then I'm going to switch it off. So for me, generally, image stabilisation is very often switched off. So what about focus points? What is the best options to choose for your focus points for birds in flight? I'm going to go through the different options on this camera, the 1DX Mark I. First of all, we have a spot focus. This is designed for situations where it's very, very cluttered and maybe the bird's behind reeds or branches and you want to try and get that really accurate focus on the bird and nothing else. Secondly, this is the default option, which is the single focus point. And this is the one that I would advise using the majority of the time. It's the one that I use the most of the time. And this one I just find to be very accurate and very fast. Then we have AF expansion. So we have a center focus point surrounded by 4 focus points outside that. Then the next AF expansion, which is a center focus point surrounded by 8 focus points. And then we have the zone focus and the AF area focus. So these are using a bigger area and they're allowing the camera to do autofocus point switching, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Now personally I find that the single focus point works really well for me, and that's one I use a lot of the time for photographing birds generally, and often for birds in flight. Even when I'm tracking the bird in flight, I like to try and be more specific about where I'm aiming. I'm always trying to aim towards the head of the bird, so I'll often use the single focus point for that reason. The next option I'll use is AF expansion, either with the 4 focus points around or maybe the 8. And the reason I do this is just I find it's a bit better for speed. And because it's a little better at picking up the general movement, what I suggest is if you're going to use more focus points like that AF expansion, that's going to work better in situations where you've got a very clear backdrop. So either it's very, very out of focus background, or it's against the blue sky. Alternatively, the single focus point I think is better where you've got a nearer background and it's a little bit more cluttered. It helps to make sure the camera doesn't lock onto the background. Now a lot of people ask me about the autofocus case settings and which ones I would use, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. This is most useful for Canon users, particularly 1DXs and 5Ds, 7Ds. But it's also useful if you have Nikon or Fuji, maybe Sony. So Canon have designed a number of case settings with different parameters to suit various scenarios. My advice is not to just go with those different cases. What I suggest is you actually make sure that you understand what the different parameters are and how they work differently, and then try and adjust them to your shooting style. So on cameras like the 1DX Mark I, you'll find a number of cases going from 1 to 6. And if you look through those, I'm not going to go through each one individually, because you can have a look at those, and if you press the info button when you've selected each one, it will actually bring up some extra information to tell you how it works and the situation that maybe it's best for. So the first parameter is the tracking sensitivity. Now this one goes from locked on the left hand side to responsive on the right hand side. And basically what this does, it adjusts the speed that the camera will respond to something new that comes into its focus points. So how this is relevant to birds in flight: if you imagine if you're tracking your bird in flight and you're trying to keep the focus point or focus points on the bird as best you can, occasionally you might not keep up with that and the focus point will drift away, maybe onto the background, and then the camera maybe focuses on the background and you have to go back, try and get the camera back to the bird and locked on again. This parameter allows you to adjust how quickly the camera is going to refocus and reacquire focus. So basically if you set it to the locked on position, -1 or -2, when you're tracking that bird in flight, if the focus points come away, they go onto the background, the camera will actually take longer to refocus, which would give you more time to readjust, to catch up with that bird, get back on the bird and keep it in focus as you're panning. If you go towards the responsive side, +1 or +2, then the camera is going to lock onto that background faster. So it would make sense generally, you would think, to go with -1, possibly -2, if you're tracking a bird in flight and keeping it locked on the bird. So what I'd say is if I photograph in a bird that's fairly small in the frame and maybe the background's a bit more cluttered, I'm maybe going to go more towards the locked side, -1, -2, just to reduce the likelihood of the camera locking onto the background. The opposite of that, if I'm photographing a very fast moving subject and it's a clear backdrop, then I might actually go more towards the plus side, the responsive side, because I'm more concerned with just pure speed of the camera locking onto the subject. And the next one is the accel and decel, so acceleration, deceleration. So this parameter is designed to cope with changing speed, so acceleration and deceleration. So again, the relevance with birds in flight, there's many situations where the birds are not flying at consistent speed. So in theory, if this one is set to -1, -2, it's going to be much better suited to a bird flying with fairly consistent speed and not erratically. If it's set to +1, +2, then the focus system should cope better with changing speed, acceleration and deceleration. So I actually find, when I've tested this, I find it quite difficult to notice a massive difference, but it's very difficult to test this in real world situations in exactly the same conditions over and over again when photographing wildlife. My feeling is that setting the accel decel to the plus direction does help the camera to cope with changing speed, and a lot of the time with birds in flight they're not flying consistently, so it should help cope with changing speed if you set it at +1 or +2. So the third parameter is the focus point auto switching. So this one will only work if you've got multiple focus points selected. It won't work if you just got a single focus point. And the way that this one works is, again, if you're panning with your bird in flight, trying to keep that center focus point on the bird, but then you've also got a number of focus points around the outside. If the center focus point gets away from the bird, what will happen is the outer focus points will take over. So the camera will switch to the outer focus points to keep the bird in focus. So if the bird drifts away in one direction, then the camera will switch to those focus points on the edge that are nearest to the bird to keep it tracked, to keep it in focus. If you wanted no autofocus switching, select 0, and then +1 and +2. That's going to basically dictate how quickly the camera switches those autofocus points. So if you use +1 or +2, that's basically increasing the speed at which the camera switches over to those other focus points. A lot of the time I'd rather rely on my own technique, try and keep the focus point or the focus points on the bird. I don't want it switching around too much. Again, if it's very, very fast, so if I'm photographing diving red kites, for example, as I do a few times over the winter, then I'll probably add maybe +1 of focus point auto switching, just because they can get away from the focus points because they're moving so quickly. Now, I have done some tests of my own to see what difference these parameters make, and some of them it's quite difficult to notice the difference, but absolutely the one that makes the most difference is the tracking sensitivity. So if you change the tracking sensitivity from -2 to +2, you will notice a difference. I think for myself, I've probably come to the conclusion that if I'm photographing a bird which is reasonably small in the frame and perhaps the background's a little more cluttered, then it's probably better to use -1, possibly -2 for the tracking to stop it locking onto the background. If the bird's filling more of the frame and the background is nice and clear, then I might go more towards the plus side, the responsive side. The reason being that I think it just actually helps to focus a little faster. So it is down to your technique as well, how good or how bad your technique is. If you're someone who's very, very good at tracking birds and keeping the focus point on it, then it might work absolutely fine on 0 or +1, making the focus responsive. If you struggle to keep the focus point on the bird when you're tracking, then it might be better for you to go -1 or -2, which gives you more time should you drift off the bird. I suggest, rather than using those case settings specifically, try and test it yourself, and then you could change the parameters as necessary, or maybe set up 2 or 3 individual ones, which you could then possibly register in the green menu section. That's not something I've played around with yet, but you could actually register it and save it in the menu. That was painful. Painful. On the Canon, you'll see there's an option of AI Servo image priority, and there's first image priority and second image priority. Basically how this works is that the camera allows a certain amount of time to confirm the focus before it takes the picture. So we're only talking maybe a fraction of a second, but you'll see on the left you've got release, and on the right you've got focus. So it's basically how much time the camera takes to confirm focus before taking the picture. So if you set this to the release side, then the camera doesn't take quite as much time before it allows you to take the picture. Alternatively, if you set it to focus, it's going to take more time to absolutely confirm the focus before it takes the picture. And 0 in the middle is kind of a compromise between the two. So it might make sense to think that you want to make sure the picture's absolutely focused, so it's better to set it on the focus side. Now, the problem with setting it at focus is that when you're taking a lot of shots with a fast frame rate, because the camera's trying to confirm focus each time, it can actually slow the frame rate down. So if you've got your 10, 12, 14 frames a second, if you set the image priority to the focus side, it will actually slow the frame rate down and you may only be getting 5, 6 frames a second. Alternatively, if you set it to speed, then it means you can get the highest frame rate possible and the camera keeps shooting, but it might not be guaranteed that as many shots are pin sharp. So you kind of have to make the decision on that one. So personally, most of the time I'm keeping this in the middle to give it equal priority. And then if I'm photographing something very fast, very fast moving bird, then I'm actually setting it to speed, because I'd rather that the camera took lots of frames a second and I relied on my technique than waiting for the camera to confirm focus each time. So that's my personal preference. And there's just a couple more things you can do to increase your chances of getting those pin sharp pictures. The first one is actually to try and reduce your aperture a bit. So rather than shooting at a really wide aperture of f4, f5.6, particularly with a big lens, if you go down maybe closer to around f8, what that's going to do is increase your chances of getting a pin sharp picture on around the head, because you're just giving a bit more depth of field. So if the focus point gets away, the camera doesn't quite keep up with the bird in flight, then that little bit of extra depth of field can help you get the sharpness you want. Also, you might notice you've got a focus limiter switch on the lens, so this can increase the speed of focus. If the bird is quite some distance away, then you can actually just flick that focus switch. On this 400mm lens, it goes from 3.5 meters to infinity and then 8.5 meters to infinity. So if I set it to 8.5 meters to infinity when the bird's distant, then it's just taking out that nearer range, so the camera doesn't have to focus on the nearer range and it should be a little bit faster. And then one more thing that I'd advise you do when you're tracking birds in flight is just to try and get slightly ahead of them. And this again just takes a bit of practice, but it's really good technique. So rather than just relying on the camera and the focus points to keep up with the bird and keep it locked on, try and predict the movement as best you can. I do find myself that if I can just get slightly ahead of the bird, I seem to get more consistent and sharper results. So if you can do that, you'll probably find you get a better hit rate. Thank you for watching the tutorial. If you found it useful and you think other people would find it useful as well, then please do consider sharing the video. Also, any likes, of course, greatly appreciated. And if you haven't subscribed, then click the subscribe button and the bell icon for notifications. Feel free as well to add a comment in the box below if you want to tell me how you set your camera up with its various autofocus capabilities. Not just for myself, but also other people will find it really useful. It's really good to share from these videos so people can share their techniques and hopefully become better birds in flight photographers. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.